Welcome to LexisNexis Risk Solutions Facing Change series. I'm Angus Sim, and today I'm delighted to welcome Steve Coppard. Steve is the Deputy Director of the UK's debt management function at the Cabinet Office. So a very warm welcome, Steve. Now, what impact is the coronavirus crisis having on personal and business debt management in the UK?
Hi, Angus. Thanks very much for having me. So I think at the moment we've seen an awful lot of people who work in UK call centres in debt management who are either being furloughed or switching to working from home, where the business had been able to actually deploy the technology quickly enough. We've seen some really interesting developments through enforcement agencies, so that's bailiffs essentially, who down tools very quickly. It's difficult to comply with social distancing if you're also visiting people at their homes. But what we've actually seen them do is come up with some fantastic initiatives. So we've seen bailiffs using their vans to deliver shopping to vulnerable people in their communities. I think sitting at the centre of government, we also have a good view of what's going on in the broader space. So we work to link up the collections industry trade body, so that's the Credit Services Association, and the Civil Enforcement Trade Body, so that's the CIVIA, with other parts of government and private sector that are looking to match supply with demand. So, for example, we've got UK companies at the moment who are having to bring their contact centre operations back from abroad because those countries happen to be on lockdown at the moment. And what we're trying to do is to say, well, actually, we've got a lot of people engaged in debt management who are unable to work at the moment. Can they work in that different type of contact centre environment? So I think the response across the sector generally has been quite phenomenal. Last week, for example, we saw in response to the COVID-19 outbreak, the Department for Work and Pensions, which has temporarily paused the recovery of benefit overpayments for 3 months, and it will review in due course. And then a private sector company called Just, which integrates High Court enforcement activity, has committed to not adding any further charges to any customer who falls behind on their payments as a result of COVID-19. And then we've got the government's Money and Pension Service. It's releasing incredibly detailed set of guides to help people out with their finances at the moment. So we're seeing generally, that across the industry, whilst it may not be able to continue business as usual, we're seeing everybody pitch in and do what they can.
Given the myriad of challenges you've just outlined there, how is the government's focus changing as we tackle this crisis?
So I'm a big believer that if you work on delivering principles rather than products, and critically, if those principles were the right ones in the first place, then you should probably already be on the right track. So something we've spoken about as a team quite extensively is the stigma of debt in the UK. So last year there was a YouGov poll that found 44% of people are happy to talk about mental health issues, but only 22% will talk about debt. Just think about that for a minute. More than twice as many people will tell you they're depressed as will tell you they're in debt. So in the same way there was that national push to lift the stigma of mental health over the last decade or so, we also need to do something to lift the stigma of debt. The synergy here, I guess, being that both mental health and debt are likely to get worse unless you engage with them proactively and you consciously work to improve the situation. Part of that, I think, means that the collections industry needs to take a think about its image. And this, again, is a conversation we've had a few times now, and we really need to start acting on. So we call it the collections industry, yet collection is only one possible outcome, alongside debt relief orders or IVAs or bankruptcy. These can all be the right outcome dependent upon the circumstances. But collection speaks only to those people who own the debt rather than those who owe it. So I prefer to speak about debt resolution instead of debt collection. And when we do that, we really get into the heart of things. And remember that in simple terms, debt's just a product of an incomplete transaction. The only way to close that transaction down is to arrive at an arrangement that's acceptable to all parties involved. And that's the rub, right? Debt resolution is about people, it's not about numbers. When we focus on getting people out of debt rather than getting debt out of people, we're much more likely to arrive at the right outcome and not disengage people from that conversation.
So you very clearly set out there, Steve, the challenges we face. But how particularly is the government going to focus on supporting vulnerable people through this crisis?
So we have in government the fairness principles. These sit at the heart of our government debt strategy. They're actually laid out in legislation in the Digital Economy Act Code of Practice, and they map directly across to the Financial Conduct Authority's guidelines on treating customers fairly. So the three pillars of that are affordability, vulnerability, and signposting free debt advice. So with affordability, we look to ensure that any repayment plan that is set up takes account of people's ongoing needs. And actually, when repayment plans don't break, we spend less in repeated interventions. We keep failure demand out of the system. And in the private sector, it saves around £82 million a year in not having to make those interventions. For vulnerability, it's making sure that we truly understand people's circumstances. So we had a great case study from Hyde Housing Association that chose to not evict vulnerable families. Over the course of about 90 families that it managed to keep in their homes, it saved around £800,000 in legal fees and also brought in another £1.2 million in rent payments. Now that's just 90 families. Imagine what we could do if we took that approach to the whole of the UK. And then finally is signposting free debt advice. So we've seen when people actually understand their financial circumstances, they're far more likely to make realistic repayment plans that can have as high as a 95% stick rate.
That sets out where we are right now in the middle of this crisis. As we look forward, how's the government planning to support people in the medium to long term as this health crisis winds its way through?
So from my perspective in the debt management space, I think how we exit this current period will define us as much as how we responded at the beginning. So I've been thinking about this in terms of we're currently across the industry at a bit of a red light when it comes to collections. We've paused, stopped an awful lot of activity, and we already know what the green light looks like. So that's the business as usual collections process that we've just exited from. So my deep thinking at the moment is what does the amber light look like? We don't have that at the moment. We know that those people who are financially impacted by the crisis at the moment, in fact, whenever people are financially impacted, regardless of the surrounding circumstances, we know that the return to financial health is not something that happens overnight. Yet we do have the ability to turn the collections activity back on overnight. So we just need to think about that and be careful about how we approach it. So to do that, I'll be speaking to colleagues across the industry, in central and local government, the trade bodies, the collections and enforcement agencies, think tanks, policy institutes, charities, advice agencies. We try and bring everybody together to ensure that we take a measured approach to that.
And to wrap up, Steve, on a broader note, perhaps a positive note, think of a different dimension. You see what goes on in other parts of the world in terms of different practices around your industry. Do you see any lessons that can be learned elsewhere that you'd like to bring to the UK? Perhaps this crisis can be a catalyst for some positive change?
So at the moment, because debt management tends to take a while to work its way through the system, it's too early to tell. We are watching other countries and in other parts of the financial world. We're speaking to sort of Five Eyes nations, but we need time for the scenarios to play out. And I kind of, what I'm looking at the moment is that different countries are taking different responses. It's going to be quite a complex landscape to model. And to be perfectly honest, I think if we focus on some of the things I've spoken about, if we focus on resolution over collection, if we focus on getting people out of debt rather than getting debt out of people, then we should be okay.